I look forward to the month of May because that always to me means the Charleston Festival.
A place of great cultural interest and very beautiful.
Hello and welcome to Charleston Festival at Home. My name is Susanna Stevenson and I'm the Artistic Director for the Charleston Festival. I'm here in the first room ever to be decorated at Charleston. This is Clive Bell's study. When the painters went off to the studio to paint, he came here in order to write. And tonight we're hearing from a great writer, Salman Rushdie, joining us all the way from New York to talk about his life and work with writer and editor Erica Wagner. All of the events as part of Charleston Festival at Home are going out online completely for free. If you've been enjoying them, please consider making a donation to the Charleston Emergency Appeal. And now it's my pleasure to present Salman Rushdie in Conversation.
I am so delighted to be here, if only virtually, with Sir Salman Rushdie and with you, the audience of the Charleston Festival. I know how sorry we all are that we can't actually be at beautiful Charleston, but I, for one, am delighted to be supporting the festival and the place in this way, and I very much hope we'll all be able to gather there again before long. Salman is in New York, and I'm in London, so we'll have a transatlantic conversation, and perhaps that's no bad thing, as no doubt we'll be speaking not only of art and literature, but what's going on in both countries and indeed in the wider world. That wider world is brilliantly encompassed by his Booker shortlisted novel, Quichotte, which is an adventure, a quest, a love story, a meditation on fact and fiction and history, and of course, a riotously good read. The last goes without saying, for Rushdie is one of the finest authors we have, as well as being always a delight to converse with. He is the author of 12 novels, including Midnight's Children, winner not only of the Booker Prize in 1981, but also the Booker of Bookers in 1993 and the Best of the Booker in 2008, which is really quite something. He has written books for younger readers, Haroun and the Sea of Stories and Luca and the Fire of Life, and the screenplay for the 2012 film of Midnight's Children, directed by Deepa Mehta. He has also adapted that novel for the stage. His memoir, Joseph Anton, dealt with the 9 years he spent living underground following Ayatollah Khomeini's fatwa in 1989, and a compelling and important testament to freedom of speech. Oh, and it's really funny too. He is a fellow of the British Royal Society of Literature and holds the rank of Commandeur in the Ordre des Arts et des Lettres, France's highest artistic honor. He has always been closely involved with PEN, the international organization promoting and helping to protect free speech, and for a decade was chairman of the PEN World Voices International Literary Festival, which he helped to create. He is distinguished writer in residence at New York University's famed journalism school, and he also played a significant role in the 9th season of Curb Your Enthusiasm, which is right up there with his knighthood in my book. At the heart of Quichotte is its protagonist, an Indian-born immigrant to America, a sales rep for a pharmaceutical company, a man whose dreams, like the dreams of so many of us, are larger than his life. Addicted to television, he falls in love with one of its stars, the beautiful Salma R, and determines to pursue her, driving across his adopted homeland in the company of a son conjured from his own imagination. That précis can't do justice to this fine book. I'm lucky, as are you, that we can discuss it in depth with its author now. As Lucasta Miller wrote in The Spectator, Quichotte is a literary embarras des richesses, written with the brilliant bravura of a writer who can really, really write. More to the point, it's also funny and touching and sad and oddly vulnerable, rather like its eponymous hero. Salman, it's great to speak.
Thank you, Erica. It's great to be with you. And I have to say, as you said, I mean, I loved being at Charleston when I was there a few years ago, and I'm really sad not to be there in person. Again, it's such a beautiful place and a beautiful festival, and I'm happy at least to visit it in this way.
Exactly, in our imaginations. I was thinking before I did this, and thinking about the broad scope of this novel, I was looking at your website, which I haven't done in a while. I think it's been recently refreshed. And one of the things I liked about it is there's a tab called Uncategorized, which seemed to me to kind of encompass the conversations we've had, and indeed this novel, which takes place in the age of anything can happen.
Mm-hmm.
So shall we start there? Perhaps say a little bit about the age of anything can happen. I think when I first imagined having a conversation like this with you, I didn't think what that might really mean.
Well, I think we all know now, I mean, that somebody eats a bat or a pangolin in China and the whole world changes in 5 minutes. The lives of everybody in the world transformed overnight, something which we would not, if we were talking in January, we would have had no information that was about to happen. So that's what I'm saying, I mean, in another sense, if Trump can be president, then anything can happen. I mean, there used to be, I've been a Spurs fan all my life and therefore not well disposed towards Arsenal. There used to be a right back for Arsenal called Lee Dixon, who once, I think, was once capped by England. And every time Arsenal came to White Hart Lane, the Spurs fan would sing, "If Lee Dixon can play for England, so can I." and it's that the world is so unpredictable and so metamorphic. It changes at such extraordinary speed. And in such radical ways, that even, I mean, leaving aside the coronavirus, it's a time of very rapid change.
I was going to say, what does that mean before we get to the meat of the novel? I feel that change is more rapid than it was when I was younger, certainly. And I wonder what the pace of that change means for you as a writer. Do you find that you have to think differently? Does it affect your process, your thinking?
Well, I think what it does is you can't write a book which assumes that the world simply is what it is. Because 5 minutes from now, the world will be something else. And if you have to start from that position of, what could you call it, kind of radical uncertainty, you have to recognize that, and you have to be aware of it as an artist. That you can't write the 19th century novel in which the world is solid and stable, and so are characters. Characters are solid and stable.
Yes.
Now we live in a world in which we know about our own selves that we are fragmented and mutable and endlessly changeable. And so is the world we live in. So I think for me, that's a starting point. You can't write the kind of novel which doesn't recognize that. At least for me, I can't, So, I mean, it's dangerous to prescribe anything in general because all writers will do what they want to do anyway.
I feel like it's interesting. It makes me think, listening to you say that, it makes me think of Midnight's Children, though, actually. It makes me think of a novel that begins when a country is created out of nowhere, out of nothing, in an instant.
Out of nothing. I mean, one of the things, there's a line buried in there somewhere, which points out, which was the truth, that the country of India never existed until August the 15th, 1947, when it was made independent. So this country that had never existed acquired its freedom. That before the British, there had been kingdoms all over India, but there had not been a united nation. of India. The British at the peak of the empire ruled only like 2/3 of the landmass, and had relationships with the princely states that created the rest of the country. I mean, they were not equal relationships. The British were very much in charge of them, but there was no unified country, and so extraordinarily, the India that came into being at the moment of independence had never previously existed. It was a kind of fiction that everybody agreed to believe in.
Yes, yes. Let's move to the meat of this novel. Tell me a little bit about its title, and indeed perhaps your relationship with Cervantes' novel Don Quixote. We'll come to the other inspirations and sources for this novel, but let's start there.
Strangely, the beginning of this novel, I had thought I might write a non-fiction book about traveling across America. I had thought that I would rent a car and drive across America in a kind of Tocqueville kind of way, and just sort of see what I could see and experience what I could experience. And I actually asked my younger son Milan, who was, now he's almost 23, but this was 4 years ago or so, and if he'd like to go with me, because I thought it might be interesting to have the point of view of a younger pair of eyes. What they saw would be not the same as what I saw. And he said, yeah, he'd be interested to do it, but he didn't like the idea of me driving. So anyway, we talked about it. In the end, meanwhile, serendipitously, I had been asked to write something about Cervantes. Like 4.5 years ago or so, because there was that, you remember the double anniversary of Cervantes and Shakespeare.
Yes.
And I was asked to write something comparing and contrasting those two giant figures. And so I read Don Quixote again for the first time in decades. And what had happened in the meanwhile is that there are much better translations.
Right.
Than they used to be. The old Penguin Modern Classics translation, which I first read, was frankly a little bit dull, and I kind of didn't get it. Why is this the father and mother of all literature? And in the meanwhile, now there's this, I think, extraordinary translation by Edith Grossman, which brings the book vividly to life in a way that has not been available to English language readers before. And so I read it again. I said, oh, I see. It actually is one of the greatest things anybody's ever done. And then I thought, well, I don't want to do the nonfiction book. I want to allow myself to use my imagination and to let the imagination go on the journey. And Don Quixote and Sancho Panza gave me kind of permission to do that. And then quite rapidly, my characters stopped being exactly like Cervantes' characters. My Sancho, as you said, the child who's kind of wished into being by his father's need for a child, and then becomes really invested in the idea of being real.
Yes.
In this book, in which the whole subject of reality is a question mark, the one person most invested in reality in the book is the character who's invented by his dad.
Yes. Yes.
And I think, quite deliberately, he's more like Pinocchio than Sancho Panza. He even has a talking cricket.
That's right. And the blue fairy comes into it.
But it's not Walt Disney's Pinocchio.
No.
It's the original novel, which I guess not many people in England read these days, Carlo Collodi's novel called Pinocchio. And I thought, I want that Pinocchio, not the Disneyfication.
One of the things that's fascinating that you just said right now, that the Cervantes novel kind of gave you permission to do this, which I think is kind of one of the things that Cervantes has been doing for centuries, is giving permission
to so many people.
But one of the ways, to me, this permission is granted is by the way that Quixote's story is not presented directly, but through a storyteller.
Yes.
As we see, through a writer of spy thrillers who's living in New York, who we learn is, the reader knows him as brother. And so the storyteller is always kind of front and center. And there's a wonderful line, the tale and the teller were yoked together by race, place, generation, and circumstance. And it's one of the things I've always loved about your work overall, is this acknowledgement of the storyteller.
Yeah, but this I haven't done before. This, you know.
No, not in quite this, in the way that this goes back and forth.
Yeah, and to have a fictional storyteller telling the story that you're reading, you know, in the way, I mean, Cervantes has a fictional storyteller. You know, he alleges that this manuscript has been found by him and was written by this Arab, you know, Side Hamete Benengeli, is the ostensible author of Don Quixote. But I didn't want to do it. It was no part of my original conception of the book. You know, I mean, I thought the book was going to be, you know, my Quichotte and his Sancho and this journey across America in the search of this impossible, improbable love.
When did brother and sister arrive then?
Well, I started writing the book, and then they showed up. I mean, and I, you know, historically, I've rather disapproved of what now gets called metafiction. You know,
tell us a little bit about them for readers who have not yet had the.
Well, there's an author who's obviously invented by me, who's inventing the rest of the story. So it's a little bit of a kind of Russian doll of a novel, you know. And he's somebody who isn't a very good writer. He spent most of his life writing spy potboilers, spy novel potboilers, and he's reached a kind of, I guess, midlife crisis, both in his work and in his personal life. He has a difficult relationship with his son. He has a difficult relationship with his sister, and he decides to embark on a book which is like nothing he's ever written, which is in fact the Quichotte storyline. And what happens is that his own circumstances, the things happening in his own life, find a variant life in the book that he's making up. And I, you know, in the old days, I say, I used to not like books which were about writers writing books about writers writing books. You know? And then I found myself doing it and had to really seriously think about whether to have it in the book or not have it in the book. You know, I gave myself permission, if I didn't like it, to take the whole thing out. You know? And then what I found was that I did like it, because what I was doing was trying to say, this is the way in which real life is transformed into art. You know, that the imagined life is obviously a mirror to some degrees of the real life, but it's not exactly the same. You know, and it means slightly different things, and it turns out somewhat differently. And that journey from experience to the page, to my mind, that's the creative act. You know,
yeah, that's wonderful.
And so I thought, you know, it's a way for me to write about what is the nature of the act of creation, you know, and how it works.
Let's hear a little bit of that act of creation. Will you read the opening, perhaps?
I thought, yeah, reading the beginning is always good, isn't it? So this is chapter 1. Quichotte, an old man, falls in love, embarks on a quest, and becomes a father. There once lived, at a series of temporary addresses across the United States of America, a traveling man of Indian origin, advancing years, and retreating mental powers, who, on account of his love for mindless television, had spent far too much of his life in the yellow light of tawdry motel rooms, watching in excess of it, and had suffered a peculiar form of brain damage as a result. He devoured morning shows, daytime shows, late-night talk shows, soaps, situation comedies, Lifetime movies, hospital dramas, police series, vampire and zombie serials, the dramas of housewives from Atlanta, New Jersey, Beverly Hills, and New York, the romances and quarrels of hotel fortune princesses, the cavorting of individuals made famous by happy nudities, the 15 minutes of fame accorded to young persons with large social media followings on account of their plastic surgery acquisition of a third breast, or their post-rib removal figures that mimicked the impossible shape of the Mattel company's Barbie doll, or even more simply, their ability to catch giant carp in picturesque settings while wearing only the tiniest of string bikinis, as well as singing competitions, cooking competitions, competitions for business propositions, competitions for business apprenticeships, competitions between remote-controlled monster vehicles, fashion competitions, baseball games, basketball games, football games, wrestling bouts, kickboxing bouts, extreme sports programming, and of course, beauty contests. He did not watch hockey. For people of his ethnic persuasion and tropical youth, hockey, which in the USA was renamed field hockey, was a game played on grass. To play field hockey on ice was, in his opinion, the absurd equivalent of ice skating on a lawn.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful. And one of the things as we go on in the novel, one of the themes that you address is the crisis of opioid addiction in the United States. And in my reading about that, I have become increasingly aware, as I think many of us have, of the role of the Sackler family in this. Mm-hmm. But your pharmaceutical baron, who's called Dr. R.K. Smile, is, I think, based or is inspired by, connected to someone called John Kapoor, who I was not aware of. Maybe tell us a little bit about that and why you chose to take on this subject.
Well, the second part first is that it's this extraordinary, it's the other plague that is affecting this country. I think it's actually worse here, the opioid crisis, than it is in Europe.
Yes, I think it is.
But here, we have in the United States right now, something like 80,000 people who have died of the coronavirus. And the opioid crisis takes 70,000 lives a year. So it's like having an annual coronavirus plague that's been going on for many years now and has been a kind of hidden crisis, because not infectious, not contagious, you don't have to change your lives. But the death rate is shocking. And a lot of it is happening in Middle America. And so I thought, if I've got my characters driving in their beaten up car through this world, it's something that has to be taken on. It's one of the things that's going on. And yeah, I mean, in another part of my head, I'm kind of interested in what Indian Americans get up to. I sort of try and sort of keep a finger on that pulse. And so some years ago, I stumbled onto the story of the real story of, this gentleman called John Kapoor, whose company, well, in the novel, the company is located in Atlanta, Georgia, but in real life, it was closer to Chicago. Anyway, he had a pharmaceutical company, and his company came up with this product, which was a fentanyl spray that you spray under the tongue, which enormously increases its speed of entry into the system and also its power. And fentanyl, is the most powerful of the opioids. So fentanyl is what killed Prince.
My mother was addicted to fentanyl, so I take an interest.
And my youngest sister had an opioid habit and died of it. I mean, more than a decade ago. But that also made it kind of personal to me,
Yes.
And then I discovered about Mr. Kapoor that he was encouraging, like financially encouraging, doctors to prescribe this extremely dangerous thing to people. It was supposed to be for terminal cancer patients as a way of reducing pain. in literally only terminal cancer patients. But then it began to find its way out to many people who were not unwell, and so for me, what was interesting was not just that there's a crooked businessman, not a surprise.
Strangely
but,
enough.
But how easy it was to corrupt parts of the medical profession. And I mean, obviously not all the medical profession, there are many extremely honorable people in that profession, but there were significant numbers of doctors who were willing to, in return for money, to prescribe what's called off-label. In other words, to prescribe it prescribe the drug for things it's not meant for. And the sums of money involved were not colossal. They're not small. They were like $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, which is serious money, but it's not life-changing money.
No.
You can't retire to your cottage in the south of France. So it turns out that people's honor was rather cheaply bought. And I thought that was interesting, and I wanted to explore that.
And what brings Quichotte and his Selma together, finally, is her addiction.
Yeah, and because he's a salesman, or has been a salesman of the pharmaceutical company, and so he's recruited by his erstwhile boss to be deniable, to be no longer really with the company, but he's going to be the carrier, the mule, who brings these medications to the celebrity.
Tell us a little bit about, because I must say, I think the women in this novel are really wonderful. She's marvelous, and so is Sister.
Yeah, I'm very fond of them, I have to say, and I mean, Salma are, as you can tell, her name is a little bit of a joke because her first name is one letter shorter than mine. And my last name begins with an R as well. So you could say she's the autobiographical character, except she's not. But
She's not.
the only thing is she comes from the same neighborhood in Bombay where I grew up, and similar kind of social class as well. But the point about her, I felt, was that for Quichotte, for the person who uses the pen name of Quichotte when he writes to her, she's this glorious figure. She's infinitely desirable, beautiful, famous, rich, kind of like a goddess, right? And he sets himself the task of conquering her, and with absurd optimism, so in spite of the impossibility of it, believing that love will find a way. And I think his optimism is an important thing in the novel. But she, when we get behind the mask, and to see what she's actually like, her life is much harder than that. And there has been a lot of pain in her life. She's separated herself from her family. She has the history of sexual abuse by an older member of the family, and she's quite a sad and in some ways isolated figure, and becomes dependent on these drugs as a result. And so, yes, the odd thing is that this lethal drug becomes the means by which Quichotte can actually meet the woman of his dreams.
Maybe let's have that second reading.
Yeah, this is actually the first moment at which they actually meet, where he's been sent by his cousin, the pharmaceutical entrepreneur, to deliver the contraband to her, and they meet in Central Park at a designated spot. She was standing in front of him. He had passed through the veil. He stood before her like a fool and stammered. "Make it quick, darling," she said. "Eyes everywhere." "This is sent with all respects by Dr. R.K. Smile," he began, and then saw her eyes widen in fear and alarm. Her hand flew up to cover her mouth, and she looked from side to side, planning her escape. "Sent by Smile," she said. "Oh my God, I know who you are. You sent your photograph. I know who you are." it comes also, he continued desperately, with great, you are Quichotte, she whispered, the letter writer. Quichotte. Quichotte, he corrected her. She made a lunge at the envelope in his gloved right hand. He held it away from her. No, 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 he said wretchedly. It wasn't supposed to be this way. It wasn't supposed to go this way at all. Your envelope for mine, cash on delivery. She stepped back from him, gasping. Then from the depths of her Montclair coat, an envelope emerged. She dropped it on the ground. It's all there, she said. Now throw yours to me. He could not know if the required sum was in the envelope on the ground. But she was his beloved, and he would trust her. Madam, catch, he said, and threw her what she wanted, which she grabbed and ran, leaving him standing there with a gun in his pocket and money in his hand. It comes with great admiration from myself, he said hopelessly, with tears in his eyes.
Lovely, very good.
Didn't go well, that first meeting.
No. One of the things that you said just now when we were talking about opioid addiction was keeping track of what Indians have done when they come to America and become Indian Americans. But one of the things that happens, particularly as Quichotte and Sancho make this road trip that you yourself did not make through the United States, is they encounter racism.
Yeah.
They are very much made aware of the color of their skins. And I wonder how, well, obviously it was important for you to include it. I perhaps wonder how much you think attitudes have changed or indeed got worse.
I don't think it's so much that they've got worse as that the worst things have been given permission. You know, the way in which this administration uses dog whistles all the time to signal to various kinds of bigotry, you know, has given to bigots in America a sense that they're entitled to be like that and to express that, and that it's somehow an American thing to be. And I mean, for example, there's one moment in the novel when they're passing through a town in Kansas, and they're in a bar, and some crazy guy comes in and shoots up the bar, and two Indian Americans having a drink are hit by bullets, and one of them is killed and the other one is not killed. And I mean, that's based on a genuine incident. I've changed the name of the town in the novel, but the incident. And what struck me was I was watching on television, I was watching the widow of the dead man being interviewed. And she was saying, you know, we've lived here for so many years, a long time. You know, our children have been born and raised here, and we think of ourselves as, you know, this is home. And then this terrible thing happens, she said, and now we have to ask ourselves, is there a place for us here? Mm. You know, and that sentence, is there a place for us here, really struck me very deeply. And it's one of the characters in the novel asks that question. You know, and I mean, it's a novel about immigrants in America. You know, almost all the major characters have come from another country, you know, and some from England, some from India, some from elsewhere. And you know, I always remind myself that there is that statue in the harbor, you know, yes, which welcomes immigrants, and that after all, unless you're native in America, everybody's an immigrant.
That's right.
Everybody's an immigrant, you know.
Yes, unless you're indigenous.
Unless you're indigenous, yes, unless you're Native American.
Yeah.
So the idea that there should be bigotry against immigrants is bizarre in a country entirely created by immigration. And so I've always, you know, in my life, I mean, I've kind of been a migrant for much of my life, you know, first from India to England, and then the last 20 years from England to America. And so for me, I've always, first of all, it's who I am. It's enabled me as a writer, you know, that experience. It's really, a lot of my work has grown out of that, and the interminglings of those worlds, you know, and what it's given me is an enormous amount, you know. So I've always thought that it was a phenomenon to celebrate more than to fear, you know? But now we live in this different time, you know? So I just wanted both the celebration and the fear,
yes,
to be there.
you have too the celebration on, I say on these shores where I am in England, because of course you have sister, who is also of Indian origin, but is a QC, so is at the heart of the establishment.
Yeah, and very successful. Very successful, and when we meet her, sadly not very well.
Yeah.
But actually, she was one of the characters that I hadn't expected would be as significant in the book as she became, you know. But the moment I started writing her, I thought she was really so interesting that, you know, that I wanted more of her, you know, and she kind of pushed herself forward in the book, in the writing of it, and became to be one of the real discoveries of the book, that character, you know, and was a way of saying something about what's happening in England.
And also, I suppose if actually, and I wouldn't have perhaps expected this before I read this novel, but now having read it, if you said to me, Erica, what is this novel about? I might just say it's about family.
Well, I'll tell you what it is about. It's about what I felt quite strongly, and I felt it not just in this novel, but for a while, that literature tends to focus a lot on love defined as romantic love. You know, love between men and women, men and men, women and women, but, you know, but romantic love. I have become very interested in these other forms of love, you know, the connections which are longer lasting sometimes and unbreakable sometimes. And if they're broken, it's very painful. You know, family, parents and children, brothers and sisters, what happens between us in those relationships, you know, and so I wanted, so in both the storylines, both in the story of the author and his sister, and in the world he's creating of Quichotte, who also has a sister from whom he's also estranged, it was a way of looking at sibling relationships. And then they both have, in both storylines, there's a father and son engagement, you know, in which, and it doesn't go the same way, the two stories, you know. But I wanted to look at those things because I think those are as deep, you know, and sometimes more, affect us more than falling in love, which can be brief.
Yes. And I found it very moving. You put, the other day, you put photographs of your two very much grown sons on Instagram, saying that you hadn't been able to see them throughout this.
Well, we're all in that boat, aren't we? I mean, I was last in London on Boxing Day.
Right.
And spent, I mean, I'd spent Christmas with them. And I left London on December the 27th. And now here we are in the second half of May, you know, and I mean, I've never let it go that long, you know, and so it's, I mean, but this is now commonplace, you know, we all face this, separation from people we care about.
But I found those, perhaps because one is thinking about all those separations, I found the depictions in this book of those father-son relationships.
Well, I'm glad, you know, and one of the things that came from, again, an accidental rereading of a book, you know, I accidentally, because there was some anniversary of its publication, picked up the old hippie text, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, you know, and when I looked at it again, I thought, well, never mind Zen, and never mind motorcycle maintenance. But what was interesting in the book was that it's about a father and a son on a motorbike driving through America, trying to forge a better relationship, you know. And I thought that I can use, You know, so a little bit of this came out of Robert Pirsig as well as Miguel de Cervantes.
I will have two quick final questions, because I think we'll probably need to wrap up. One is, I'm wondering if you've heard or expect to hear from Paul Simon.
Oh, Paul. I mean, no, I haven't heard from him. I do know him a little bit.
I will explain, I will admit, perhaps you explain why I ask you this.
There's a character that Quichotte's sister in the book is known only by her nickname. And her nickname is the human trampoline, which of course comes from Graceland. And although the meaning of it in my novel is not the same as in, you know, in the song, it's a somewhat derogatory term. You know, and the people who call the person in question the human trampoline they're not being kind to her.
No.
You know, whereas in this novel it has a different meaning, and she doesn't mind being known as it. You know, but yeah, I stole it from Mr. Simon.
But it gives that to me just gives a sense of that this is also a novel of multifarious, magpie-like cultural reference. I do think, you know, I tried to use everything I know about literature and about the arts in order to try and make sense of this crazy moment, you know. And so, yes, of course, Cervantes is there in the title of the novel, but, you know, there's also Eugène Ionesco. There's a chapter which owes something to his play Rhinoceros. I think there's a lot of Dickens in the way in which it looks at the world, you know, and Voltaire, you know. I mean, Candide is a novel about a kind of innocent abroad in a time which is not very innocent, you know. And by the way, the subtitle of Candide, Voltaire's novel, is optimism. Candide ou l'optimisme, you know. And what I liked about my character was his ludicrous optimism about everything from his chances with Miss Salma to everybody he meets. You know, he thinks the best of people even when they're awful. You know, and I thought just to project this absurd optimism across a country which is not perhaps going through its most optimistic moment, you know, that would be a good. The dialogue between those two things would be interesting. Are you, that maybe perhaps leads me to a final question, which is, are you optimistic?
Yeah, I mean, that's, you know, where it came from, really. Because, I mean, people make fun of me. You know, my friends make fun of me for being optimistic when there's no apparent reason for it. So, in spite of everything, not to believe the worst. You know, I'm not good at despair. You know, and I often think of it as bordering on the self-indulgent. You know, there's a phrase, there's a saying, but maybe a good way to end really. It's saying by the Marxist Italian thinker Antonio Gramsci, where he talked about what we need is pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And I that's as good a belief system as I could come up with.
That's very good, and that is indeed, in these times, a good note to end on. So thank you so much, Sir Salman Rushdie. It's, as ever, a joy to speak to you, and I look forward to our actually meeting in the not too distant future.
Next time in person.
Indeed.
And also with everybody
exactly
who's listening to this. Thank you.
Thank you.